the Paris campus, beautiful campus with a beautiful weather as well. Thank you for coming and participating to this conversation about internet governance. I'm Constance Deleuze. I'm the Executive Director of the Technology and Global Affairs Innovation Hub here at Sciences Po. I'm attached to the Paris School of International Affairs. And it's wonderful to have with us a distinguished panel experts in this field of internet governance. We're going to be talking a little bit about how internet governance and digital protocols interact with global affairs. This topic of how the internet functions, how it's structured, how decisions are made is not well understood sometimes by policymakers or other leaders. And as a European university, we thought it was really our duty to bring this conversation to our students, to the academic community here in Paris, and also have a bit of a conversation about how these topics can impact global affairs, cybersecurity, health, women empowerment, any of the SDGs you can think of, the Sustainable Development Goals, are impacted by the way the technology is governed. So today we're going to talk about different models of governance and why they matter. And for this, I'm very happy to have with us Claudia Leopardi, who is co-organizing this event. Some of our other co-organizers are AFNIC Association, the French AFNIC Association, I think ICANN as well, and RIPE NCC. Voilà, so back to you.
Thank you very much, Constance. Hi, everyone. I'm very glad that you were able to make it here. So today we have such a busy schedule that I will start right away. First of all, let me thank the Cybersecurity Association for the help and everything, because in the remarks, it has to be done. But yeah, so today we'll be talking about three main topics. First of all, will be the multi-stakeholders versus a multilateral approach to internet governance. The second would be the current internet governance processes that are happening, and more specifically, the Global Digital Compact and the WSIS Plus 20 review. And as last, but definitely not least, it would be about human rights online and internet fragmentation issues. So let us start with the first. Multi-stakeholder versus multilateral. What is it? When we talk about multi-stakeholder, multilateral, it's quite in the word. Of course, there are two approaches, among others, in which we can regulate the internet. And if I would ask Chris Buckridge, who's an expert in this and then has recently published a paper on SANDR on the topic. So can you give us insights on multi-stakeholder versus multilateral, and what is best for the governance on the internet and why?
Thanks, Claudia. I'm going to put this here because I'm going to talk for far too long if I don't pay attention. I'm here today, I guess, partly as a member of the Internet Governance Forum's multi-stakeholder advisory group, and that's kind of not the end point, but one of the sort of far-reaching points of this multi-stakeholder idea of what internet governance should be and how it should be done. But so if we sort of go back, I started working in this space around 2003, which was around the point of what was called the World Summit on the Information Society, a UN process that began looking at internet governance. And at that point, you already had, well, the internet was already doing pretty well, let's say. The reason for that WSIS process was because the internet and digital ICTs were becoming such a prominent part of everyday life. And so governments and citizens really were saying, okay, we need to have some say on this. This can't just be something we leave it to the technical engineers and they do what they like. But there was also a sense of, okay, we want to tame this, we want to have some control or some understanding here, but we also appreciate the goose laying the golden egg here. We don't want to kill that goose. We want to see the benefits of the internet, and we want to extend those benefits to as many people in the world as possible. And at that time, that was really the majority of the world who didn't have that. At this point, there is still a very significant part of the world that doesn't have access. And so what they were looking at in the WSIS was how can we move forward with a new governance approach that builds on what the technical community has done. And for the internet, that meant a very open, inclusive governance process where everyone who wanted to be involved could take part in the conversation, say, this is my proposal, defend it, try and get it adopted by everyone. But then also bring in some other stakeholders who weren't necessarily used to that kind of process. And so that's one of the real challenges of multi-stakeholderism, is that when you bring in governments and you bring in people with public policy makers, they're not really set up to take part in that sort of open process where everyone is just representing themselves and their ideas. They're representing a government. They've got a huge bureaucracy behind them. What they say needs to be signed off by people back in capital. And that's one of the real challenges that particularly some of the technical organizations, and RIPE-NCC is one example, I think ICANN as well, have looked at how can we incorporate stakeholders like governments into a process which is inherently open and kind of based on individuals and ideas and consensus building. And that's been really the story of the last 20 years as we try and find ways to integrate those two different modes, multiple different modes of governance. And so the outcome or the result of that has been really an ongoing discussion and argument about what is a multi-stakeholder model. And there are in reality multiple multi-stakeholder models. So the model that ICANN has is very different to the model that something like the Internet Engineering Task Force has, which is very different to something like the Internet Governance Forum, which is much more based within the UN and so very much more close to traditional governmental processes. And I think that diversity is really a strength of the system and the process that we have. It's finding the right model for what you're trying to do, for what the task at hand is. And that's going to be something that goes on continually. And I think AI is an example right now of a new task which is being put to us, where we're trying to find new models, new approaches, and how do we manage that in a way that reflects the needs of all stakeholders. I might stop there.
I think you said plenty, and but since you mentioned the model of ICANN, then I would give the word to Chris Mondini. If you want to introduce yourself and maybe to the people that don't really know what ICANN is and what its purpose is.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see so many of you with an interest in the topic. My name is Chris Mondini. I work for ICANN, Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. I sit in our Brussels office. We exist because the internet is not the internet. It's not a single global network. It is a network of independently owned and operated networks. And this is something that's very crucial and very difficult for people to understand. So whether it's networks among satellites, the network we're using in this building, the network that's connected to your phone, those networks are choosing to interconnect because they use common protocols and standards that are available to everyone in this very open, as Chris said, voluntary way, that if you have an innovation or a device or an application you want to create, you can connect it to this network of networks using those protocols and standards. The inventors of the internet wanted everything to be very distributed and very voluntary, but try as they might, there was one thing that they could not distribute. And that was the system of addresses and identifiers that we all use to navigate the internet. So every device, and we're up to about 80 billion devices worldwide now, whether it's a connected fridge or anything in your pocket or on your lap, and about 2/3 of humanity are all findable because the addresses are unique. Every device has its own address. So first and foremost, what ICANN does is we maintain those addresses. They're on the shelf, they're available, we distribute them through partner organizations. And that's our technical global function. We also convene a community because these systems are not static. There are innovations, there are changes, whether related to security or the addressing system that we know well as humans, the domain name system, which are what we use to navigate. And we do this very visibly 3 times a year in meetings, in public, open, free, interpreted in 7 languages, fully hybrid and participatory. I hope you'll all join us at our next one in Kigali in early June. Really, it's cool. You can ask a question of the ICANN Board of Directors. So we convene this community that works throughout the years to make innovations on these domain names. And then finally, we do a little bit of sort of risk management. We look at ways to mitigate abuse and problems and fraud and bad action on the internet. And I would say we monitor the role of governments because within our model, we have governments at the table. We have a governmental advisory committee that gives advice on all of these innovations that the community develops, but it's just one part, and they're at an equal footing. In fact, the innovations, the ideas come from other parts of the community, which we tend to think of in, over the period of time that Chris was talking about in 4 big chunks: the technical community, businesses, governments, and civil society. And a good idea can come from any one of those. And so what we see in my work, my day-to-day work, is that many governments that are now working on issues on the internet, applications or content that they're concerned about, I visit them in their capitals, and they don't necessarily realize that they have a colleague that's sitting at the table in the policymaking processes at ICANN. And so a lot of what I do is connect the dots, and not say that one model is better than the other, but I will say that for the distinct technical function that we are responsible for, multi-stakeholderism has worked very well, and it existed before governments even knew what the internet was.
Thank you very much for the extensive, no, we're perfectly on time, so no problem. But then I would open the floor to any comments that could be sparked by what has been just said by either Francesca Musiani, an associate professor.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I'm Francesca. Hello, everyone. I'm a researcher with CNRS. I guess probably you know what CNRS is. It's like a big research center here in France. So I'm working on different facets of internet governance. Most recently, I've had a research project on Russia, in how Russia controls and governs the internet, in particular its national internet. So in terms of contributing to this overview, so perhaps I will give a viewpoint from somebody who has started her career looking at internet governance things through an institutional perspective. So I did a master thesis on the Internet Governance Forum, like it was the time when the first edition was taking place in Athens, I think in 2006, if I remember right. So I did start by looking at institutions, and they keep on being relevant and increasingly diversified, and perhaps I will come back to it later when in my small allotted slot. For now, I guess that I just want to point out the extent to which this whole landscape of complexity in internet governance is made even more complex by the fact that not everything goes through institutions, be they states or multi-stakeholder or multilateral institutions, but there are several things that happen within the private sector or by virtue of the diversity of uses of the internet by particular communities. Let's think, for example, about Wikipedia, that has found its own way to govern itself in ways that do not pertain to states, do not pertain to the private sector, and it still works. They have established their own set of rules that are constantly readjusted and discussed within that community. So that's one part of the internet that has established its own way of governance. And then there are a number of uses of the internet by particular communities that are not what the developers of those tools originally envisaged. So that's something that sociologists of technology and innovation like myself tend to like to look at, because it's there is a number of technical choices that are inscribed initially in the technologies, how they are first developed and created, and then something happens along the way that that makes it a bit different than what was initially expected, and oftentimes there is some politics inscribed in the way these tools change and how they are reappropriated by communities. So yeah, I guess that I just wanted to add to this initial overview this particular layer that is not institutions, but at the same time is in constant dialogue with it, because institutions observe this and sometimes try to learn as much as possible about it, and eventually start to regulate part of what is new about what happens de facto in multiple arenas of the internet. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Chris, of course, go on.
No, I just very briefly, I think the point Francesca made is really important. One of the terms that you hear used a lot is permissionless innovation. And this idea, that's that idea that, things will be used in ways that they weren't necessarily intended for, and that's a good thing. And what we're trying to foster or protect in all of these new approaches to governance is, how do we keep an open to innovation ecosystem alive? Because, it's very easy to clamp down with control and say, okay, this is it, we're done, this is what the internet looks like, we're going to control everything. And that's fine, and it would probably make it very secure, and it would probably, but it would probably also stop the innovation. It would stop the sort of new services and the new growth and the way that the internet has grown. And it is remarkable to think that in just 30, 40 years, we have gone from literally the internet being nothing to now being such an important and major part of our societies and our lives. And that it may not always grow and change and develop at that rate, but that sort of development is something that we absolutely want to foster and want to protect.
Thank you very much. Makes sense. Guillermo would like to.
Yes, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm the multilateral person here. I guess that's why I was invited. So my name is Guilherme Canella, and I'm the chief of the Freedom of Expression and Safety of Journalists in UNESCO headquarters here in Paris. Just to add to the discussion, it seems to me that the panel had a affirmation, multi-stakeholderism versus multilateral solutions, which I'm not totally convinced that this is the right approach. Maybe it should be a question mark, or should be an addition or a complementary view, no? Because it's not necessarily that those two approaches, they are an opposite to each other. So if you take, for instance, what happened during the pandemic, and the follow-up discussion with my colleagues of the World Health Organization that are currently discussing a global convention on how to fight pandemics. Of course, a document like that, for the reasons of how the health authorities in different countries need to combine their decision-making process, requires a multilateral process. However, if you look into the text of the convention, there are several elements related to internet governance, which does not prevent them, or shouldn't prevent them, to incorporate the different actors in this discussion. So it's a combination of a multilateral process that it's very much needed for the logic of that kind of process, but which should have a strong element of multi-stakeholderism on that. So I think we need to be careful in not putting these things as necessarily opposite elements, when the real challenge, and it's not an easy one, is precisely how to see the added value of those different elements when they are necessary, which ones can achieve the decisions that are needed in a way that is doable, of course, in terms of achieving decisions. So I would say that the history of multilateralism can offer some sort of path dependence, to use Douglas North's view of building institutions, on also to the discussion of multi-stakeholderism. But if you look into the history of United Nations after the WSIS process, you can see the lessons learned of this multi-stakeholderism being taken by other areas that are not necessarily the internet. So I also, on the positive mode, I think there is a cross-fertilization of this discussion between the two fields. Of course, I'm being very positive and optimistic here, Rosie. There are lots of problems, of course, in these things, but I would encourage to have a view also in terms of how these things can take advantage of the best of the two models, and not always they should be put as opposites.
Thank you very much. I think from this part of our conversation, we've gotten quite a few very good points. Some of which are basically that each system needs different processes and approaches to their governance. And as also in the example of Wikipedia given by Francesca. And I agree with Mr. Canella when saying that we shouldn't really be talking about multilateral versus multi-stakeholder, but it should be more of a inclusion, let's say. Well, then this very smoothly can bring us to the next topic, which is the current internet governance processes and outputs, and their opportunities and challenges. Today we'll be talking mainly about the Global Digital Compact and the WSIS Plus 20 review. Global Digital Compact, also for the friends at the GDC, it's a document that is currently being drafted by the UN, and that envisions some principles put together by different stakeholders in the internet to foster a safe internet for all and inclusive. And then the WSIS, maybe I will let someone also discuss it. Here then I would give the word to Francesca. So what are the opportunities and challenges of the current IG processes and their impact on the governance in the internet? And if you can maybe describe a bit what WSIS was and what WSIS Plus 20 will be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so maybe actually the two particular processes that you're talking about, I know about like an informed citizen and a specialist of the overall area, but I'm not informed about like what is happening like day by day in these processes. So maybe I will leave the floor to somebody else to talk about it. Still, I think that what I can be useful for to start this particular segment of the panel is to indeed draw somewhat of an overview about IG arrangements, like in their diversity, and point out a few challenges that. Among others, the Global Digital Compact and WSIS Plus 10 challenges that they are facing in this landscape. So. Of course, like the first thing that is good to point out, hope you're well, Chris, is that there is indeed an increasing diversity of IG arrangements. There have been layers of needs about internet governance institutions that have been added throughout the history. So there was the start with a so-called cyber exceptionalist phase, in which there was this idea that the internet was supposed to be a completely a different entity from whatever we were trying to regulate in the past, and so probably it needed to be left on its own to flourish as it was. This didn't last long, and there was for a number of reasons that have already been touched upon. And there was a second phase about creating ad hoc institutions for particular needs of the internet. And so ICANN has been introduced because it was responding to one particular need. The IGF process that was the main consequence of WSIS, so of the World Summit on Information Society. It was the main outcome. It happened because it was recognized that there was a need of a multi-stakeholder arena with no decision-making prerogatives, but that was able, precisely because of the fact that it was not aiming at taking decisions, it was supposed to bring many different people and entities to to the same table, and so on. So these first multi-stakeholder arenas are still ongoing. So in particular for IGF, there have been periodic discussions about whether they should still stay as they used to be in their first mandate, whether they should be replaced by something else. So all of this happens because they have inherent structural strengths and weaknesses to carry out their mandates, and also because the internet evolves around them, and so do the kind and of stakeholders that are interested in it. And also, I'd like to point out that there are other more recent arrangements that have seen the light with more specific purposes that cannot entirely be defined as multi-stakeholder, but are still interesting to talk about in this in the same framework, such as, for example, the GIFT, the global alliance that is supposed to counter terrorism, so by means of establishing policies of content moderation, for example. So this is a fairly recent entity that is a private sector led, but at the same time has manifests its intention of being a large alliance for an objective that is of like a human rights preservation, like it's via content moderation, more effective content moderation. Still, some of these arrangements have some degree of opaqueness, so this has to be taken into account. And so despite the fact that more and more of these alliances do exist, what is more paradoxical and interesting to acknowledge here is that the impression we have as internet users more often than not is one of polarization, and so we will talk about fragmentation in the third segment, but so it's right now I will just say that this impression of increasing polarization, fragmentation is so it comes with this idea that states and other powerful actors of the internet think that they should oftentimes go not with big alliances, but with autonomous, increasing their autonomy, increasing their independence. This is something that is often called digital sovereignty. So like this idea that autonomy and independence should be increased, often citing protection of citizens or protections of users and consumers as the main reason for increasing this autonomy and independence. So we have the states and supranational entities that reaffirm themselves, often by bypassing multi-stakeholder arrangements to the extent that they can. And this happens in a variety of configurations. There are authoritarian states like Russia that do it in some ways. They're often trying to isolate their national internet. Europe, with its set of regulations that are broadly the object of broad consultations, that are democratically elaborated and led, one could argue that they are still in some way fostering some type of fragmentation. We will come back to this. So yeah, it's interesting to see like all these kinds of concurrent challenges that multi-stakeholder arrangements are subject to. And so now we are at a moment in which, indeed, with WSIS plus 10 or with well, I have some skepticism about what this particular meeting is going to bring with this very short delay. But Net Mundial plus 10 is also currently in conversation. So I am. It's supposed to happen at the end of April, and they started to bring it together in February. So I'm not really sure what form this will take. But still, it should be mentioned that this particular movement that is supposed to be the successor of Net Mundial, which was the main multi-stakeholder process that came out of the Snowden revelations, and the idea that well, other countries and other actors should take their prominence in the international arena when it comes to internet governance. So right now we probably are at a state of maturation, or at least attempts to both continue what has been done in these multi-stakeholder processes and at some time innovate themselves in these processes. And I think it's an interesting moment. But to see what if the dominant actors will keep on being dominant, or if something else is in the future for these processes.
Thank you very much. Interesting to see the general challenges that these processes are going through. And next, honestly, I have so many questions to all of you. Maybe next we can go with Chris Mondini, since I honestly just wanted to ask about ICANN's role in the current UN processes, and what are the things that you guys are advocating for and against.
Well, in fact, it was alluded to before. People who are active in the Internet Governance community are active in all of these different fora. So whether it's the Internet Governance Forum or the Net Mundial, which, famous Brazilian meeting from 10 years ago, which is worth checking out on Wikipedia, or signing up for the one next month. So it's of interest to the people that are active in our community first and foremost. And so the internet really runs on those people, which I think is very important. The second point that I need to make is that ICANN, I alluded to the fact that sometimes I go to capitals and I explain to governments how the internet works and how it's working actually quite well. But if they proposed a law or legislation or regulation, whether it's in Moscow or Beijing or Brussels, ICANN will never say that's good or that's bad, or you can or you can't do that. That is the domain of governments, and it's up to them to do what they think is best for their countries and their people. What we will do as ICANN is, again, as I said, explain the technical workings of the internet, what I started out with. It's a network of networks. More connectivity gives you more resilience, gives you more greater internet. And a lot of times we'll also ask a government, what is it that you're trying to solve? What is it that you're working on, that you're trying to get at? And more often than not, it's something related to human behavior on the internet, using content or using an application. And they mistakenly believe that regulation that might affect the infrastructure can somehow just be a shortcut to, quote unquote, fixing it. And then certainly there are those countries that are really looking for more just control of their citizens, of what they're up to on the internet. What I think that we would like to get out of the current processes, the multilateral processes at the UN, is really not to be a topic of discussion. We 20 years ago, as Chris said, it was really set ICANN and other inter multi-stakeholder bodies in the technical area over in a corner and called us the technical community and said, we'll run those in the bottom-up multi-stakeholder process. And that the governments at the table will really address the things that they really care about, which are much more related to things like the Sustainable Development Goals or protecting against harms that are caused by content or use of the internet, not the internet itself. So I think what would be successful for us is to have that reaffirmed. And we see this sometimes in legislation where I've seen this more than once now, because what happens is either a legislator or a multilateral organization who doesn't have a solid understanding of this network of networks that I described, they'll write something that either means that it wouldn't work properly, or they'll write something that's covering something that's already governed at a global level in a place like the Internet Engineering Task Force or the World Wide Web Consortium or ICANN. And so now they sometimes put in like a carve-out that says anything that's already governed in a global multi-stakeholder setting, we'll take those rules as part of our rules. And I mean, that's an emerging new best practice. So I guess to sum up, I would say we'd like to, be recognized as a technical community, be recognized that we're in charge of keeping the underpinning of the internet working, and that the energy of the governments can be on other issues and other areas, which come to us for advice when they need to know how it works technically, but we don't really, we're not involved in those, I would say, very normative, values-based, culturally based debates, if that makes sense.
It does, definitely. And maybe now I will give the word to Yuan, the perspective on the matter.
Well, it's a lot to take, so I don't know where to start. So first, I would say, to be the polemist, I don't fully agree what Chris has just described, because I don't think not even the engineers are excused for respecting human rights. So they can say, we don't care if you guys do this thing that it's to cut the freedom of expression of others because we are only the technical community, right? I know that is not what you are saying, but there is this idea that you have something that is very technical and then there is no issues with the rest of the agenda. And that's therefore, that's why multistakeholderism is so needed, because if someone says that, someone else should say, well, but if the technical solution is creating a problem for the protection of this Declaration of 1948 that no one in this room or in this planet are excused to follow, and we are all under this idea, at least the 194 member states of the United Nations, then someone should raise the voice, right? And it's not always an easy story, because sometimes you use these as Trojan horses, not actually to protect human rights, you use to violate human rights. So quite often, governments use nice excuses, for instance, the protection of children, which is a very legitimate aim, but at the end, what they want is to censor legitimate political speech. And this balance is not easy, right? If you look during the pandemic, again, that is the most recent example in terms of a massive thing, more than 50 governments enacted the so-called anti-fake news laws, with allegedly the good intention of countering this misinformation regarding the pandemic. But the majority of those laws, unfortunately, were not aligned with international freedom of expression standards. So our role is to say, well, this is a problem, because it's not your own countries have agreed on these international standards on the first place. So how we fix this idea and how the governance of the system can help to have a solution, or at least necessary safeguards to avoid these problems. This is related to what I think is a huge issue for the multistakeholderism, that the number of players around the table, and this is good news, but make it more complex, has increased a lot since Athens 2006. So if you look to the overall UN definition of multistakeholderism, we talk about government, civil society organizations, companies, the technical community, and the academics, and so on, as if those things were monoliths. But when you look into the governments now, the electoral regulators want to say something because this information is impacting elections. And judges need to take decision about the internet, but they don't fully understand how the internet works. So the government is not a diplomat going to IGF and making a discussion, which was very much the case in 2006. So how we include the judges, the prosecutors, the electoral managerial bodies, the health authorities in the category government. And when you look to civil society, and I will stop with this example, otherwise I could go on and on. In the beginning, it was very much freedom of expression groups and some particular interests like children's safety. But now everyone is impacted by this and wants legitimately to have a voice. And they don't necessarily agree with what is the best solution. So how multistakeholderism will encompass that is a real challenge, because and I finish with that, the digital rights groups, for instance, they sometimes have an approach that we are the only ones in civil society that really understand what is happening here, which is not true. We also need to hear the children's movement and the women's movement and the people with disabilities movement. And every time you add a new category to this, you add a new perspective, you add a new view that not necessarily understand all the complexity of this game. Our job as the UN is to how we empower all those different groups to come around the table with the necessary instruments to have this discussion, at least with some equal level of conversation, etc. It's not possible to have a 100% perfect, but we need to invest more on that.
I will allow Chris to have the last word. You put together basically all three topics in one answer, so you're already ahead of everything. But one last word on the topic of the.
I'm not sure I have a huge amount to add to what's been said here. I absolutely agree with the point that the technical community can't be sort of taken out of the equation for sort of the bigger political, sociological discussions as well. And actually, there's been a lot of really interesting work in the Internet Resource Task Force and the Internet Engineering Task Force looking at human rights actually in the development of protocols, because these protocols that the internet runs on, technical protocols, they're still created by humans. They're still created by people, and they can still reflect the biases or the prejudices or the, lack of foresight that people will always have. And so there is a need to sort of bring, like, multi-stakeholder needs to be not just one directional of saying, okay, you need to have the technical community consulted in public policy. It also needs to mean, policymakers, civil society coming into the technical discussions as well, because these are all so tightly interwound together, and will all impact each other. It's that sort of web of often unintended consequences or unforeseen consequences that mean we need to do this in a very cooperative, inclusive way, rather than everyone making their own decisions and just seeing what effect that has on the global internet.
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah, of course.
I was thinking that to mention the Human Rights Protocol Consideration Working Group as well, and I was also thinking that perhaps I was going to cite what Jeff Houston, who's a prominent IETF person, has just said recently. So I cite, he says, "It is disconcerting for me to hear the IETF is being ascribed with such levels of power and influence in the international political arena." So actually, this just goes to the point, to add to the point we just made, that is to say that technical standards organizations are primarily led and developed by the technical community, and their goal is certainly primarily technical, in the sense that it is about building largely shared and solid standards for the internet, and that's technical. However, via initiatives such as this particular working group, or more generally with broader discussions about how human rights and protocols do intersect, well, I guess we can confidently say that building technical standards in a large sense is also about internet politics. It's not because it's not like a content moderation or hate speech or freedom of the press that are more immediately thought of when we think about internet regulation, that it's not internet politics in the broader sense to make internet standards.
This undiscernible link between politics, of course, and internet governance is it's a perfect way for us to transition to the last topic, actually. So, which is, as mentioned before, it's about human rights online and internet fragmentation issues. So many things to say here. We can start by kind of defining what internet fragmentation is, a sort of analysis of it and its implications. Has the internet ever been a single entity, or should it be imagined more as a network or networks, as Mueller would say? What kinds of fragmentations do we see in the current and future states of events? And to this, I will give the word to Chris.
Thank you. Fragmentation. Just rhetorically speaking, fragmentation is kind of the opposite of what we want for the internet. The internet that we want is single. It's holistic. We want to be able to have whatever point on the network, my phone, be able to connect to whatever data center or other point on the network that I wanted to, as long as both parties are consenting to that. So that idea of fragmentation has been thrown around a lot as just the opposite of good for the internet. And that's okay, but what it means is that it gets very difficult to define because a lot of people have different ideas of what fragmentation actually means. So the Internet Governance Forum, well, others in this field have done this as well. Most recently, the Internet Governance Forum established a group to talk about internet fragmentation, and one of the first things it did was look at what are the different ideas or definitions we have of what fragmentation means. And it came up with technical fragmentation, governance fragmentation, and fragmentation from the user perspective. Now, the user perspective, I think, is a little controversial to say fragmentation, because I think a lot of people will look at situations where, say, there has been an internet shutdown and people can't reach other points on the internet that they want to and say that's fragmentation. It may be, but I mean, I tend to think that's more just bad actions by people in control. Like, the internet is designed to allow you to prevent people accessing your network or going from one point to another. And so that's something that can be done. We probably don't want governments doing it in a lot of cases. That's a bad thing and it affects human rights. I'm not sure it's necessarily fragmentation. There is much more fundamental fragmentation that actually does happen at the technical layer, though, or can happen at the technical layer. And that really stems back to this idea, and Chris mentioned it before, that this voluntary nature of the internet. The fact that we have a global internet really comes down to some pretty basic but pretty fundamental agreements that we all have. So, like, we all agree that there is a root zone file, which is the authoritative root zone file, which tells you where you reach a certain URL or a certain website on the internet. And we rely on that because if I type in this domain name, I want to reach that point at the other end. We also agree who actually is responsible for managing those different files or sort of protocols. ICANN, in the case of the root zone file, the regional internet registries when it comes to IP address registries. And then we also agree on how those organizations should be managed. And that's generally in a very multi-stakeholder way according to different models. Now, I think what we find ourselves in at the moment is a geopolitical, sociological moment where there is a danger of those agreements actually fracturing, and certain actors, certain countries, certain governments saying, well, actually, no, we don't agree that this organization or that organization should be responsible for this. We're going to set up our own, or we're going to set up our own root zone file. Now, this hasn't generally happened yet, but we have seen incidents which have hinted at the possibility of this. And if that were to happen, it would have really significant consequences for the global internet. And so this is why looking at that fragmentation idea is actually a really important topic for us to be talking about in internet governance discussions. The other one, which I'll quickly touch on, because I think it's also important and goes back to the second topic we discussed, is governance fragmentation. And one of the real issues we have here, because this is all so important now to our societies and to our citizens, because there is so much complexity, we're seeing a huge range of different venues and conversations where all of this is happening. And the Global Digital Compact is actually an example of that, because the UN already had this WSIS process. And so WSIS actually involves lots of different UN agencies. It's actually a very broad-based, multi-stakeholder process. But at a certain point a few years ago, there was this break, and it was like, okay, we're going to set up a Global Digital Compact. We need this, but separate to the WSIS process, with some connection, but it creates an additional area there. Actually, it's not the only example within the UN. You also have discussions going on about AI. You also have discussions going on about cybersecurity in a number of working groups there. You have discussion of a cybercrime treaty, which is currently well advanced. Now, there is justification for all of these individual initiatives or sort of tracks of governance discussion. But the end result is it's much harder these days to actually keep track of all of the different discussions and how they might interact with each other. And coming back to the point I was making before, all of these things impact each other. All of these things affect each other. So if we make a cybercrime treaty which has, say, some rule that spreads to the whole internet, that's also going to affect what's going on in ICANN. It's going to affect what goes on in the protocol development in IETF. But we may not have full visibility and understanding of all of those different impacts because of how convoluted and complicated and fragmented the governance discussions have become. So I think that's something that we really, as a global community, need to be looking at. How do we mitigate that? How do we actually try to come back together in a holistic, cooperative approach which will allow us to make the best decisions and not have too many adverse side effects?
Thank you, Chris. You gave a very good overview of basically all the discourse on it. Of course, you defined that. Now I would stay on this question. Maybe if anyone would like to kind of expand or argue about, argue a bit too much, but about the point that Chris made about in the three different fragmentations about the user perspective, for example. Like, of course, it's quite a debated one. Like, is the internet that I can experience when I'm in Italy, my own country, is the same that a person in China or in Ghana has? Is that fragmentation, or is that in a certain situation just, as you mentioned, bad actions by the people in power in certain parts of the world that maybe we don't agree with in their system? But no, if anyone would like to expand or.
So from my perspective, and I think really the ICANN perspective, we're very focused on this technical fragmentation. And so if we are still continuing to use the same globally agreed consensus-based protocols and standards, then to us, that's the fragmentation that we're most concerned about. What you've described a little bit to me from, again, sitting from that perspective, is more like different user experiences in different parts of the world, again, based on what's on the internet, more content related. But I often come back, because I do meet people and that say, oh, well, what's the importance of the global internet? Everything I would just want it in my own language and my local news, and all I have, I don't need the global internet. And I remind them about the experience of COVID, where people were immediately sent home as students and workers, and were able to work continually because of the performance of the internet and the technical underpinnings of it. And so that was one good thing that the internet did. But the other thing that the internet did is it allowed the sharing of research data among virologists and doctors to arrive at a vaccine faster than any vaccine had ever been developed. And that was connections that were global. So the importance of being able, any one of us, to be able to connect with anyone else on the globe, to me, remains a really important value that we really should uphold in all of these definitions of fragmentation. So, and I do know, then jumping back to some of these protocol layers, again, on my travels, I know of at least 2 governments that have told me that they have the wherewithal to make their own set of internet addressing system and have an alternative route system. And I know of a third that would like to try to figure out a way to make the internet just stop within their borders, which of course to me is just madness. But there's the motivation is there. And then some of what Francesca was talking about earlier is some of the really well-intentioned governmental actions that think that by creating more sort of centralized or geographically based infrastructure might make their infrastructure more secure or more sovereign, actually has the converse effect of giving it more a single point of failure or a single point of attack. So again, the best advice I can give you is the programs like the ones that you're participating in, which link technology and technologists with these governance and global affairs types of discussions. These are the most interesting questions I think in the coming decades, at this time that Chris described as sociologically and geopolitically very complicated. But if you can either study some technology yourself, learn programming, or make friends with technologists, or learn how things work, and have a trusted technology friend that you can ask about how these things work, because you will be so much more informed when you go into these debates. So anyway, I've strayed from the question, but from the ICANN perspective, we're very, very focused on these protocols and standards that remain common. And we're still open to innovations and improvements in them, of course. And the thing about the ICANN multi-stakeholder model is it's bottom up. So remember this is another thing I need you to remember from this session. There are multiple perceptions of multi-stakeholderism, and Chris alluded to these at the beginning. The ones that tend to be more on the technical side are what they call bottom up, which means that any of you, first of all, they're free. You can walk in the door of any of these meetings, and any of you can show up with an idea to improve something on the internet, which is incredibly powerful. So my colleagues of mine that work in governments or work at UN agencies, they'll say, okay, well, our multi-stakeholders consultation, we get everyone at the table and we go around and get all the feedback. But usually the sort of the right of initiation, where that comes from, it can come from any corner of the community. So the technical community might come up with a security standard that becomes a global standard, all because one engineer decided it would be an improvement, and then the governments and the businesses and the civil society agreed with it. Innovations like domain names that are expressed in different alphabets. So we have 2/3 of humanity using the internet, but most of the remaining third does not use an alphabet that most of us in this room are using. They're using Devanagari, they're using Mandarin, they're using Cyrillic, Arabic, you name it. And because internet users, this came from internet users, they said, let's invent domain names in different alphabets. And the government said, that's a great idea. And the businesses said, oh, that's awesome. We think that's a great idea. And civil society said, that's fantastic. And UNESCO is a huge partner in all of this because linguistic inclusion is really important. But that came from internet users. So what's I find so exciting about the corner of multi-stakeholderism that I sit in is that the good ideas can come from anywhere. And then finally, the last thing I will say is, again, for those of you studying international relations, come to an ICANN meeting and you can sit in our governmental advisory committee and you can see these debates among countries that don't normally even talk to each other. And you can see countries that often have, you would think have views about the internet that wouldn't have them at ICANN. We have Russia, we have China, we have Brazil, we have Saudi Arabia, and they're speaking up and talking about their vision of the internet. And where else can you see that happening? You'll see it at the United Nations in the coming months, but you can also see it in the Governmental Advisory Committee part of ICANN. So again, we'll see you in Kigali, even if it's just online.
Yeah, of course. Go, Chris.
Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic. I just want the universal access that Chris was talking about. So making sure that different scripts are actually accessible is a really good argument for why a non-multi-stakeholder approach would be such a bad idea, because it's not just about saying, okay, we're going to put non-Latin scripts into the root zone file. It's not just about sort of people accepting them. It's about all of these different applications, all of these different parts of the internet that have to accept that, have to be updated, upgraded, and that there is no sort of big lever that you can pull on the internet which will make everything change. The internet is literally a network of autonomous networks, autonomous systems. You actually need to work with all of the other people on the internet if you want to create something or a change like that, which is obviously for the best and that we want to see happen. But it's not something that governments can do alone. It's not something that engineers can do alone. It's something that needs to be managed in a multi-stakeholder way.
Thank you, Chris. Quickly going back to what Mr. Mondini was saying, it is true that the ICANN meetings are quite incredibly horizontal in the way they work. I had the opportunity to go to Hamburg in October, and it was really impressive how you could see different people from different systems speaking together and how approachable people were at the meeting. So I'm also a supporter of the go, but slightly, it's fine. And so thank you very much. And thank you, Chris. I would then move towards, still in the same topic, more on the human rights side, towards the to present the guidelines that UNESCO prepared for the governance of digital platforms, and which are basically can be seen as solutions to safeguard freedom of speech online and multi-stakeholder governance.
Thank you. So, I mean, again, I will speak about the guidelines in a second, but just to say that I would strongly encourage a perspective that don't put these different concepts as separate little things in the same basket, right? Like if the fragmentation or the technical elements of the internet is one thing, and the human rights approach to this is a different story that we also need to pay attention. Actually, the internet was possible in the first place because we have scientific freedom, because we have freedom of expression. Otherwise, all these were not going to be possible. You can look, the ranking of innovation is very much related to the countries where you have more freedom. So actually, human rights are enablers of the existence of all of these that we are saying, and not the other way around, no? That said, of course, the current logic of the internet, or maybe the one that was that we are trying to protect, has produced huge advancements in terms of human rights overall, and freedom of expression in particular. It's actually the first time in human history that some of the groups that never had their freedom of expression possible, it's possible because of the internet. You take children, for instance. Children historically were groups that were, their freedom of expression was mediated by the adults, the parents, the teachers, whoever. And now, for the first time in human history, children have freedom of expression. And this frightens people, frighten teachers, frighten parents. But if you look in the Child Convention, the Article 13, it's there. Countries have agreed. Children have freedom, they also have freedom of expression. So the issue from a policy point of view, and I'm saying policy, not politics, because policy concerns all of us, is what is our goal with all of these? No? Why we don't want to have a fragmented internet? So if the goal is a further protection of human rights and democracy and development, so we need to put the governance system with this kind of goal. And then we need to find the necessary safeguards to guarantee that, and not having a fragmented internet. It's important because these goals, we have so many transnational problems in this planet, climate change, pandemics. If you think even corruption, Panama Papers, for instance, it was not possible without a global internet to produce something like that. But the issue is we need that because we need to fight corruption, because we need to address climate change, because we need to protect human rights. And that's why we want to have as a goal not having a fragmented internet and other things, no? So when we have that, then we can look into governance systems that are more or less useful to this goal. So this is what we tried to do with this governance guidance for thinking this problem. So if our goal is to protect freedom of expression and access to information, how we develop a governance system of the processes of the digital ecosystem that actually protects this goal. And you can say, well, but what is the balance with hate speech or disinformation or whatever it is, conspiracy theories or child pornography and so on? So freedom of expression and access to information is a right that it's a right to speak, but is also a right to receive information, ideas, knowledge. So when the digital ecosystem is completely polluted with obstacles, my right to say something that is disinformation or hate speech would be being protected, but her right of not being offended, of getting information that is accurate and reliable, can be jeopardized by this. So how we develop this system, these processes that are not related to specific pieces of content. If we say that curation and moderation of content is a way of doing that, this curation and moderation should be in the different languages we speak in this planet. But the whistleblower of one of these major companies said that 87% of their budget was invested in curating and moderating content only in the English language. So they have elections in Indonesia, and instead of moderating the thing in Bahasa in Indonesia, they moderate the things in English. So of course, this is unacceptable. And this regulation has nothing, asking them to moderate in several languages, has nothing to do with restricting freedom of expression or the fragmentation of the internet. On the contrary, it improves freedom of expression. It improves the capacity of this network of networks to have people interacting with each other. So I won't be able to enter into the details. The document is this one, and it's available in I don't know how many languages online. But the real story here for us in this conversation about the governance, etc., is we need to recognize that there is no simple solution for complex problems. And this is a complex problem. It will require all those different players and these different institutional structures that comes from civil society, from the companies, from the UN, from the governments, etc. But with a clear goal. If the clear goal is to further protect freedom of expression, how we do that, looking into these processes rather than the discussion that we are having today that I think you mentioned. The government think that looking into a specific piece of content that is also is mainly related to the behavior of people will solve the problem, rather than looking to the processes that can facilitate governance that actually can help us to achieve these goals, that is have, I don't know, better elections, better in the sense that people, whoever is their decision, they have this decision with the information that is not full of these obstacles. Or they can take decision of being vaccinated or not, but without lies about what happens with the vaccines, and so on and so forth.
Here I am. Well, thank you very much. I read about it briefly when you mentioned it, and I find it very interesting, and I honestly have to read a bit more about it, but thank you very much for the overview. And if Francesca would like to have final, I would say if you have some final thoughts, and then I would go around with the final remarks by everyone.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, maybe two things. Like the first is that concerning fragmentation, indeed that the governance fragmentation indeed is twofold. We tend to think about, well, in the first place, about the alignment of the internet with national borders, like Russia tries to do, like China does to some extent, and so on. But indeed, it is like there is another that is perhaps less known, and you did great in pointing that out, which is the fact that even among the global alliances, the wide multi-stakeholder networks, the multilateral arrangements, there are just more of them, like a lot of them, and so the mere fact of being literate about these things is contributes to the overall complexity and therefore fragmentation of this whole scenario. And maybe another thing that I wanted to point out about these the way in which national borders and intersect with these matters of the internet being an infrastructure that is more concentrated in places, more distributed in others, less present in some regions of the world than others, is that there are some perhaps more recent debates about, for example, digital labor or digital colonialism, the extent to which there are some infrastructures in particular regions of the world that are serving the interests not of those regions, but of others that have a history of capitalism before and digital capitalism afterwards. So all these debates, I think that they are less removed from what we've been discussing right now than they might appear, because they do contribute to tracing physical landscapes of what the internet is today and point out some imbalances that might be partly historical and partly generated by more recent dynamics about technology and economy and politics. But overall, they tend to make the internet less distributed and symmetrical than it was envisaged in its early days, and they are all factors that we should take into account.
Thank you very much. This part of the panel is basically over. I would say each of you, if you would like to make some final remarks on what has been said. A lot has been said. So, yes, and the questions will, there will be now a Q&A question session of around 20-25 minutes. So I will let them do some final remarks, and then you will all be able to ask your questions. Well, in this case, then... Yeah, that also works. Yeah, I can give you. No, of course.
My name is Xian Hong from UNESCO, colleague of Guillermo. And thank you, Constance and Claudia, for inviting us. And I'm so happy to see many other friends here too. We have a very quick comments from a question, because I'm sorry I have to leave in a few minutes. I think on the multi-stakeholderism, I must agree with my colleague on such an optimism, because the concept of the multi-stakeholderism was really firstly written in a UN official text in 2005 in the WSIS Tunis agenda, WSIS Geneva Action Plan. At that time, we didn't even know if we could work out, because if you have attended the first IGF in Athens, it's the first time to see thousands of people, governments, private sector, activists in one huge hall discussing the same issues. I mean, that was an astonishing moment in my life in 2006. At the time, I heard some complaint from some diplomats, what a chaotic situation. But then you see, IGF has been succeeding. Multi-stakeholder approach became a prevailing concept till now. As Guillaume mentioned, UNESCO, as a multilateral organization, we have had this concept officially recognized by the member states in 2015, when 193 member states endorsed UNESCO Internet Universality Rome Principles, ROAM. M exactly means multi-stakeholder. This means a lot. Even now, it's impacting. For example, now I'm managing the UNESCO Intergovernmental Program on Information for All. We introduced the multi-stakeholder approach in this intergovernmental program. And then I raised a question from our legal office saying, where is the multi-stakeholder from? And then I show him the UNESCO endorsement on the multi-stakeholder approach in the Rome Principle. It seemed that that's such a fundamental change of the approach. And with UNESCO as a case, you can see it's a fundamental change. We change the way we are supporting member states on policy making. This guideline for me is also another success of the multi-stakeholder approach. I mean, if you look at how the consultation was taken, the extent of the participation of the different stakeholders. But I also see that certain are so many discrepancies and inequalities. I like to signal that what I have perceived that even after 20 years, a multi-stakeholder approach with such international discrepancy among the countries, still you see the quality and the quantity of the participation from the third world, from developing countries are still so poor. I mean, all the key discussions are so poorly attended by the people from Africa, Asia Pacific. Even this afternoon, I met with some colleagues from a Huawei company from China that came from China, and then the company, the deputy, the VP was telling me, I told him that you should come to IGF. There's so many multi-stakeholder forum. It's not only to the UN officials. He said, "Oh, we are not sure if there's any boundaries. Are we supposed to talk in this kind of global policy forum?" I said, yes, of course, policy is related to everyone. You are a key actor. Please, it's open forum. So I said, should I get any permission? I said, no, just register. You'll be there. So you see, after 20 years, still we need to get this concept to be more penetrating to all stakeholders, to all countries. And again, my experience with the Eurodig, I'm on the steering committee. I mean, even at the Europe level, if we see the gender divide among the participation discussion, we still try hard to get women, to get young girls expert to be in the discussion. Same in the developing country. When I was managing the Internet University Indicator Assessment in 45 countries, it's so hard to find any expert in developing country to do the assessment. Even you find it, we do many bidding, even they are all males, so few women experts underground to know the IG issues. I'm so happy you are here, Francis. I really appreciate it. Yes, please, that's such a gap there. Sorry, I have too long comments. That's one quick question is about now it's no longer the internet age. It's the age of artificial intelligence. It's a new age of all the frontier technology coming. What's your point? How internet governance to handle this new? I mean, it's a paradigm shift, new change to make this forum, this approach still relevant. Thank you.
Fair enough. So we can start with a few questions, and I would have wanted to do some final remarks, but we can do it at the end because there is no fixed agenda here. Constance, you have a question?
Yeah, perhaps not a question, but to confirm, I think you're right, Guilherme. You said the title should not be multi-stakeholder versus multilateral, and I totally agree with you. I've seen this evolution over the past 20 years. I worked for French government, UNESCO, Internet Society, technical community, now academia. And what we've seen really, really interestingly is some of the models of governance of the multilateral and national governmental sector infused in the multi-stakeholder processes. You have a GAC now at ICANN, you have a governmental advisory group committee at ICANN, and the other way around, governments and intergovernmental organizations have been inspired by the processes of the multi-stakeholder community. So at the OECD, now you have the technical and academic community with a permanent status. They have a seat at the table and they contribute to policymaking of government. So I'm quite encouraged by this influence, mutual influence of the multilateral and multi-stakeholder sector. And I would reinforce Xiang Hon's question. I think all the knowledge of these institutions, including ICANN, the Internet Society, AFNIC, and others who have built their governance systems, they've been creative, how they can be perhaps a source of inspiration while we're trying to figure out how to govern tomorrow's artificial intelligence and maybe other topics like quantum and others. So it's really, really important to have these multi-stakeholder conversations where we can pick from each other's brains and take the best examples. So I reinforce her question, and maybe there are other questions. Do you want to take, or do you want to?
I see a few hands. Yes. Then
I have one question. I was involved with the ICANN NCUC at the time where the governments were trying to fight counterfeiting with deep packet inspection, which was a big fear for us. because internet was based on the freedom of speech and everything. And starting by deep packet inspection was very fearful. We don't talk about it anymore. I don't know what happened. Years passed, and I'm involved with internet law. And I see our society being increasingly dependent on internet-connected devices. I also see in the international sphere more crises coming. And we see that a lot of political fights today are fought by internet and cybercrime. We see countries, we see aeroplanes being all stopped because of cybercrime. So ICANN, based on multi-stakeholder system and not national, and the English having taken over so much on the internet, what is the European sovereignty once, if by a bad chance we had some period of more trouble and less community between the countries? This is my question. What will happen? Because today, if we cut the electricity in a town, maybe half of the people won't even know what time it is. They won't have access to radio. There are lots of things we are dependent on electricity and internet and communication. So what can happen within the ICANN and the internet system if the countries are not working together and there is no such harmony that we have today?
Thank you very much for your question. I would get one last question, and then we can start answering all these questions.
Thanks so much for the discussion. It has been very lively and very inspiring. And I have a question more on the user end. And how close are we because the user fragmentation issue, in my opinion, is mainly an issue of language. So in theory, we are able to access the contents in Ghana and in other countries, but we don't do that because we are speaking different languages, and the search engines are making us show us results in our language. So with the rise of AI, how close are we to bridge this gap in a way that we will be able to enjoy and communicate quite freely any content in the world, and how this possibility will likely impact both the governance of the internet, but also on the governance side of governments. So, for example, Russia from one day to another sees that its citizens are now free to enjoy any type of content, and how certain countries will probably respond to that. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much for your question. Depending on who would like to start with the answering process. Francesca.
And maybe about this internationalizing, how to make the internet more multilingual, multi-content, I guess that there are both some initiatives have been in that sense. I guess that what we were talking about before, the internationalization of domain names, for example, have gone in the sense of acknowledging different alphabets, different besides a very Anglo-centric initial internet. In terms of what users can have access to in different countries, I guess that the example that you take about that you use about Russia is interesting, because Russia has been for quite a long time, actually until quite recently, a relatively free space for the internet. Like, there were a multiplicity of internet service providers. There was a half freedom of expression and in fact there was a number of journalistic outlets and so on, And then, there was a semi-free internet that built for decades, like much longer and much more recently than it took place in China, for example, which has a centralizing project that lasted for far longer and for far earlier and more government centered. And then there was a number of laws that were increasingly authoritarian and put an increasing authoritarian grip on the Russian internet. And one of the things that it had several facets. There was the law for the sovereign internet, the so-called anti-Apple law that established that only a number of applications that were made in Russia could be by default on smartphones or other outlets made in Russia, for example. And then there was this national technological champions part of the Russian internet strategy that was about proposing services much like China has been doing for far longer, that were made in Russia and that were supposed to bring the Facebook equivalent or the Google equivalent So I guess that all of these are part of the challenges that users face in different parts of the world today. That in the name of things called digital sovereignty or digital autonomization, it can also bring a number of restrictions on not only on content but also on the very structure of services and of infrastructures that users have access to, and so it can basically it makes it so that there are much less alternatives to begin with, and a sort of obligatory path to follow for users in several parts of the world.
So actually, I was going to seize on the comment you made about the concerns about deep packet inspection, partly because I was reading the same article by Jeff Houston in Circle ID yesterday, and there was a link to a presentation that was made at the Apricot meeting earlier this year. And one of the points it was making is that around 90% of traffic on the internet is now encrypted. And so deep packet inspection is far less of a viable thing than it was in the past. And I think that's an interesting point in how illustrative it is of how quickly things can change and how fundamental those changes can be. So this all came out really as a result of work that was spurred by the Snowden revelations. The IETF took a very strong pro-encryption stance. They worked towards encrypting really all traffic or most of traffic on the internet. That's then translated into other concerns that governments and law enforcement and others have about this encryption being used and the need they feel that they have to be able to break that encryption. And that's an ongoing discussion that we're still having. But so, I mean, I think the point you were making about the impact that, political fragmentation or political strife can have, I think all we can do in a technical sense, or the best thing we can do in a technical sense, is work on making the internet as resilient and robust as possible. Now, electricity is the one thing we really can't replace, and I think that one of the things we've seen in recent, tales of war, tales of natural disasters is if the electricity goes, then you're in real trouble. That really makes things very difficult. But I think we're also and submarine cables, submarine cables are an interesting one as well, because yes, they are susceptible to being cut, and we've seen in off the coast of Africa where a number of them have been severed, and that's had some significant impact. But we also see that there is truth to that sort of idea that the internet routes around damage, that the internet is designed to basically find a way to move data from one point to another, and if the main cable is cut, it's going to try and find another way. Probably not as effectively, but that's one of the very fundamental principles of the internet that we need to try to maintain and try to sort of respect with any public policy or regulation that we're making. And I think that's sort of the point, to come back to that sort of age of AI question. I don't know if it's the age of AI yet, but I do think things are rapidly changing, and I've been doing this for 20 years. And I think at some point I thought the steepness of the curve of how this technology was changing our lives would level off. And that hasn't really happened. And all of the AI stuff makes me think it's probably not going to happen anytime soon, that this is changing very rapidly. I mean, that means these multi-stakeholder models, these governance models we have, need to be under constant review and consideration. We need to be looking at, okay, is the model we had for the technology as it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, is it still fit for purpose with what we have now? And that's part of the discussion, I think, at a very high level that we're having about AI is, what are the principles that are good about the governance models we have? How do we take those principles forward, but in a sort of agile way to fit the new challenges that technology is giving us?
Thank you very much for your answer. Chris would like to, I would say you can definitely answer, and then we can pass to if there are any more questions, and then we conclude with the remarks. But go on,
okay.
Chris.
Yes, I wanted to echo what Chris was saying. So, and respond to the question about development of technology and new emerging ages of technology and innovation. So, again, I would say from an ICANN perspective, that's very focused on the Internet Addressing System and the Internet identifiers. All of the new stuff, whether it's quantum or AI or crypto or what have you, they're all still enabled by the connectivity, which is made possible by this addressing system. So we're still focused on having a single global authoritative address root system for the world. And yet, as I said before, any of you can come in with a new idea to improve it. We and the Internet Engineering Task Force and other organizations are open to innovations and improvements on that. But we're very happy to be able to enabling all of these new applications, if you will. The question Constance posed is about a little bit about how could some of our learnings from multi-stakeholder models be applied to things like governance for platforms or governance for automatic intelligence. And one thing that in the ICANN world, we're very lucky because the technology was already global before anybody really started to govern it. So it was a project among academics that were already working across borders. And the internet got everywhere before, as I said, people really started paying attention. And the governance model built up a little bit already along with the technology. So as the technology spread, the governance model was already there with it. And now what I see is whether it's blockchain applications or content issues or AI, is there are already very strong different cultural approaches to those in different corners of the globe. So what I see more often is more of a, instead of global consensus, which we specialize in because you need it, because everyone has to agree who gets that one particular single domain name or that one particular address. Global consensus is very hard. I see a lot of proclamations of like consensus among like-minded countries, and then within that, the application of some multi-stakeholder principles. And finally, I do want to say the good thing is people that have worked in this field have those skills. Like it's a real skill set. So we laughed when I said make friends with technical people, but go do something where you're sitting at the table with technical people, because in any of these questions, I guarantee you, if you have somebody who's an entrepreneur, business person, someone who's a public policy civil servant or legislator, someone who's a technologist, and someone who's there from civil society, each of them will contribute to the answer that you're seeking, and each of them will have a good idea about how to reach a more equitable, more accepted kind of governance model for whatever innovation that you're trying to govern or deploy in a productive way. And then on the question about scanning the world, it's a different topic. there used to be these really cool applications where you could like hover over a map of the world and listen to the radio in that part of the world. And there was also an application that used to curate like what's on the internet in Lima, Peru today. And I don't know if those still exist, but now given the translation tools, you could probably build your own, whatever cool name you want to come up with it and reserve the domain name for. You could build your own cool AI global scanning of content. The big question is how much curiosity do people have about what's going on in Lima, Peru? And so that's the thing, is that maybe we need to work on our curiosity about each other around the world. But I'll leave that in the hands of UNESCO.
Well, no, very briefly on a few things. So I think that the artificial intelligence story, or quantum and so on, of course, they bring lots of new elements that we need to think about. And to be honest, I don't think anyone has a concrete answer on how to address some of the new challenges. But one of the problems we have policy-wise is every time we have a new thing like that, it's like a new shining star there. And so everyone started running on that direction. And that's not the necessarily more productive approach in terms of policy. The first thing we need to understand what is still very valid in lessons learned of the different things we are doing. So elements that we are considering for the governance of the digital platforms, for example, like transparency of these companies, human rights risk assessments, multilingualism. This doesn't matter if it is AI, quantum, or if you want to call it banana or apple, doesn't matter. Those things are still relevant. So first thing we need to decide is what are the interesting frameworks that we have already developed that are applicable or should be applied in this, and what are the really new things. It's like, I want to enter into this discussion, like the story of disinformation, right? Recently, in the last 5 years, apparently we just discovered the powder, right? There is disinformation, while disinformation always existed, right? The same time we invented truth, we invented lies as human beings. But there are things that are really new about the way these things are propagating, etc. today. And this is the real thing we need to discuss, because if we start saying that disinformation is a new phenomena, then it's like if we're starting from zero to deal with something that in elections discussion, for instance, how to protect elections from lies is something as old as political science or something like that, no? On your question on the users, I don't think the best way is to call it fragmentation or whatever, but I do think there is an interesting way of looking in what is happening. Some of these already discussed here, but there are the other elements that we need to put into the equation. For instance, the policies of zero rating, they have generated very bad side effects for the users. So if you remember 2 years ago when Meta had a serious problems and their services were cut in many parts of the world, Instagram, WhatsApp, Facebook, many people were reporting the internet went off. And why they reporting that? Because of zero rating policies, the only experience of these users with the internet is Meta products, because this is where the telecom companies offer to them for free in different countries. So this is one particular problem that the policies should address. The other is the business model. I mean, if you have more and more the algorithms pushing people to their bubbles, it's not a matter of only of multilingualism. They are forced to be only connected and to be only in that little thing that it's generating polarization, etc. So there are different aspects of this conversation that goes beyond multilingualism or the bubbles, all the internet zero rating policies. And these all can be connected with one important thing, is how we empower the users to be out of these traps that is generated for different reasons. And your question, of course, I mean, it's I don't think it's possible to find a consensus and the different things the governments or others, legitimate or illegitimate interests, are there. But there is one interesting thing I learned from this process of these guidelines. So we had extensive consultations. We received 10,000 comments to this document coming from 134 countries. And so everything is transparent in our website. But there was one thing that was common from A to Z, different political views, different cultures, etc. Everyone agrees that we have a problem. And this seems a minor thing, but it's not. At least there is a starting point that's saying, okay, there is a problem in the system, and then how to solve it, there is no agreement. But this is the starting point of things like the Global Digital Compact of the UN Common Agenda of the Secretary General, saying, look, something is happening here, and there is the need of having a common effort to solve it. We are far away to find what is this common effort, but at least there is something that if you take many areas of our existence, there is not even an agreement that we have a problem. So at least here we are the first step that we have a problem.
We agree on the same problem.
I'm afraid that we're running a bit out of time, so I will not be able to take any more questions, but we would like to give Chris the opportunity to talk about initiatives for young people or
just
grants.
wanted to make sure that, and I know others might have ideas, but for those of you that are interested in getting involved in some of the processes that we talked about, there is in June the EuroDig, which is the Dialogue on Internet Governance in Vilnius, but also online. But really, I should promote the ICANN program. So use your favorite browser and look for ICANN Fellowship. I know we have one applicant for the meeting that will take place, the ICANN meeting in Istanbul, which will take place in November. So ICANN fellowships are available. They're a way to start a program, to become involved, to become a participating stakeholder. There is also for students, graduate students, ICANN Next Gen. That's limited to the region that you're from. It doesn't matter, you could be studying in that region too. So if there's an ICANN meeting in this region and you're from this region, you would attend and present your research and link it to ICANN work as well. And I think that that's a really, it's a great program. We have an incredible number of community leaders that are coming from these programs, and it's a scholarship to be a fellow or to be a next gen participant and attend a meeting and see all of these stakeholders doing their work. So thanks.
Thank you. Maybe if you want to add something very, very, very briefly, so that afterwards we can leave the last word to Lucien Castex.
Well, just 30 seconds about. So I was part for a year and a half of a commission of the National Assembly here, the Parliament, French Parliament, that was supposed to go back to principles of law and rights related to the digital age. And so I just find it interesting to talk about it briefly here, because we just spoke about what is new. So we spoke about what is not so new, for example, in disinformation, and the aspects that that need to be considered as novel. And so maybe what that commission was doing for a limited period of time, we can try to apply it in our respective activities and profession. It is about to always think about what is going back to what does going back to the principles mean? Like what are the reflections that have been already done in terms of our fundamental rights, the almost philosophical principles that are still subtend part of what regulation is about in the internet era, that we can still consider as valid, and not just so to not reinvent the wheel and start any regulation initiative from the urgency and the reactive mode that oftentimes is. I'm thinking about peer-to-peer, for example, that was mostly reactive, and we all know how that went in terms of regulation initiatives. So yeah, just it can apply to some of the more recent stuff, such as AI, for example.
Very quick last words. Just, look, the UN Secretary General has said that the two big challenges of the current age are the climate crisis and the digitalization of our society. And I would really encourage you, if you do have any interest, this is a really dynamic and interesting space to be working in. There are lots of opportunities Chris has mentioned. Probably also good to highlight, don't know, won't speak for anyone else on the panel. I mean, my background is not engineering. You don't need to come from a sort of engineering background for this kind of work and this kind of discussion to be something you can find your way into. And I think, interestingly, it's still small enough in sort of sociological terms that, yeah, there is the opportunity to make a technologist friend and really find your way in. So I would really encourage you to take up some or many of these opportunities that Chris is talking about and others that exist as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
The RIPE NCC has fellowships too, right? Your former employer. I just want to say, I feel very lucky because I grew up in this era of globalization, and I'm one of these globalization kids and thinks it was a good thing. And the internet also grew up in this era of globalization when it was still considered kind of a good thing, and that also accounted for its success. But we're entering an era when really, to your question, there's the geopolitical forces are centrifugal, and the schisms, whether it's trade wars or wars, are real. And so I still, remaining an optimist, believe that actually the shared project of the internet might be the last stand of globalism. It may be the one thing that we get to the edge and we almost break it, and then we realize we have the single greatest common human project. It unites more people than any other thing ever. And to me, that's still a source of inspiration. And to me, I still have hope that those of us and those of you that are working in these fields will make sure that we continue to realize its benefits and maybe get back to my paradigm of globalization being okay and good.
I would ask you to be very, very quick with the last remarks.
So my colleague is a much better civil servant than I am. You saw she did all the advertisement about UNESCO, so you can get all of that. I mean, you know that this year is what is being called the super election year. We have elections in more than 60 countries, and the 2.6 billion people are eligible to vote. So we are in this situation with the climate crisis that we have as a humanity two challenges. We need to only save our democracies and save the planet. And so I encourage you to try to attach to one of those two things. So if not the two, it's not easy, but is necessary. Thanks.
Thank you. And I leave the word to
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's been a great discussion. I'll just have a few words and not be too long. And first of all, thanks Chris Mondini from ICANN, Guilherme Caiana from UNESCO, Francesca Musiani from CNRS, and Chris Buckridge from the UN IGF. Obviously, a lot has been said already, and it was a great discussion. The topic is quite timely, actually. Before coming to this conference, I was discussing the French position for the next WTSA on some subtopics, which is a conference within the International Telecommunication Union. And before that, we had a meeting with the ITU as stakeholders about an high-level event, which is held in Geneva in May, about WSIS plus 20. So that's just today, and you have a lot of it coming in the next 2 years. Basically, what I wanted to quickly reflect on was that since the two phases of the WSIS, in Geneva in 2003 and in Tunis in 2005, the digital transformation of society has been quite broad, extensive, and ubiquitous. Everyone is actually using technologies, sometimes without knowing it or exactly knowing how it works. It's quite interesting to actually sometime, and you said it, actually, what is the internet? Can you actually define it, know that you are using it, or just using an app, a smartphone, a computer, without actually grasping what is a network of networks? The digital transformation has been extensive, and it changed a lot since 2003 and the Geneva Plan of Action. We are almost 20 years next year, actually, from the Tunis Agenda, and a lot of principles that were laid out at the time are still of great importance. And the challenges, a lot of them are still today to be met in 2024 and likely also in 2025. As we can emphasize, basically everyone is connected, and the number of stakeholders has increased since 2003 and 2005. We have obviously the emergence, I'd say, of the technical community as an independent stakeholder, but also the blurring maybe of lines between stakeholder groups, and basically a consideration of the place of internet users in the discussion. Over the next 2 years, governments, stakeholder groups will review most of the processes that have been discussed in the panel. And one of them is the WSIS plus 20 review, which is an important step. We had a review 10 years ago, which was important in laying out the successes, but also the challenges remaining to be met in 2015. And it's important to say that today there still is a lot of challenges to be met. Also, the United Nations-led Global Digital Compact is being discussed, and we are waiting for a zero draft actually this week to be discussed. So this will be interesting to actually find ways to discuss, on the one hand, the GDC, the compact, and new principles of digital governance, and on the other hand, built on the strength of the actual global multi-stakeholder and bottom-up model. And these two processes are quite intertwined and related, obviously, to each other. Also, we have a number of new discussions and processes emerging from the UN or from other stakeholders, not repeating whatever was said, but just to mention two. Last week, the UNGA adopted a resolution on AI entitled Seizing the Opportunities of Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy AI Systems for Sustainable Development. That's a lot of common wording with the actual debates on internet governance. Also, we mentioned human rights and standards. Obviously, as the IETF, the IETF, but the research group within the IETF, has started interesting work in the HRPC working group, but also published last year, we have a great report from the High Commissioner for Human Rights on actually tackling the relationship between standards, technical standards, and human rights to embed them by design in standardization discussions. At the time as we speak, there are also discussions in the ITU about that same topic. So it's quite timely. And as I was saying, both the Global Digital Compact and the WSIS plus 20 review will impact the multi-stakeholder model of internet governance. So I wanted to make two quick points. The first one is basically that the sharing of knowledge and ideas, the connecting of the world allowed by the internet, is one of the greatest success, as my colleague from ICANN reminded us. And still, we have a lot of geopolitical tensions today, fragmentation of the internet, discussion about it, and of the actual development of alternatives technologies, sometimes without or with some success. But basically, so the main and the idea behind the internet is stronger than ever, and is important to maybe recall today. It's also important to remind ourselves that a third of the global population is still unconnected. Basically, that's a lot. And also the quality of the connectivity that actually people use to access the internet is sometimes very bad in developing countries in particular. And the last point I wanted to say that cultural and linguistic diversities are of paramount importance and should be at the core of the discussion. We actually are, just let me check, two days away from the Universal Acceptance Day, if I'm not mistaken. It's like in 2 days or something. And it's one of the main challenges, actually, being able to access the internet in non-ASCII scripts, but also being able to develop and to access to local content, to grassroots content, French content in France developed by French people, and the same all around the world. That's still a challenge today, and quite an important one. My last point is that basically we also need to enable a meaningful participation of stakeholders, empowering people to actually participate. And colleagues have mentioned a few of the ways to do so, grants and fellowship programs, but also enabling meaningful participation of stakeholders around the world. It's a pivotal element to actually achieving real multi-stakeholder bottom-up governance of the internet. And in that sense, we should most likely aim at say, maybe demystifying the WSIS, and we find it quite complicated and intricate sometimes, which is quite a key point. People need to actually know what actually is the internet. And that's the main and most likely my last point. To do that, we need global venues, but we need also local venues, from a French venue to a global one, to one in the US, to one in Ghana, and to be actually able to do some sort of cross-hybridation between these venues. My last point is to thanks AFNIC, ISAC France, and Sciences Po for organizing that great event. Thanks.
He stole my words. Thanks to all the supporters and co-organizers, and thank you all for coming. And yeah, the meeting is adjourned.